Let me ask you something. What if I told you that the most dangerous evil in modern society isn't committed by criminals, tyrants, or psychopaths, but by kind, obedient, well-educated people like you? Not because they're bad, not because they're cruel, but because they've been trained to do their jobs without asking questions. The most terrifying evil today doesn't look like evil. It doesn't come with a weapon. It doesn't raise its voice. It doesn't even break the law. It signs forms, follows orders, meets deadlines. It wears a suit, attends meetings, and says things like, "That's above my pay grade." Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a German pastor who resisted the Nazis, saw this first. He watched as an entire civilized society, full of scholars, doctors, engineers, pastors, slowly handed over their conscience to systems that rewarded silence and punished thinking. From inside a Nazi prison, he wrote, "Evil does not need to look evil. It can look like law, like duty, like patriotism. And if that doesn't haunt you, it should. Because that kind of evil, the quiet, organized kind, is the one most likely to survive." Let's not talk in theory. Let's make it real. Imagine a software engineer working for a major health insurance company. His job is to build an algorithm that helps decide which patients get approved for life-saving treatment and which don't. He doesn't meet the patients. He doesn't see their faces. He just codes the system. And that system flags certain cases as financially inefficient. Denied. No one screams. No one fights. And the engineer gets a promotion for optimizing the process. What just happened? Something cold, something legal, something lethal, and no one is blamed because no one meant harm. Everyone just did their job. Now let's go bigger. A major energy corporation discovers that its chemicals are slowly leaking into the groundwater of a rural community. The company has known this for 20 years, but instead of disclosing it, they hire lawyers to bury the reports and PR firms to bury the truth. Meanwhile, residents keep drinking the water. Children develop rare illnesses. Families go bankrupt trying to pay for care. And the executives, they sleep just fine. Because all they did was protect shareholder value. The lawyers were just doing legal strategy. The PR team was just managing reputation. The employees were just following policy. No one is lying, no one is yelling, and no one is thinking. That's how institutional evil works. It doesn't need hatred, it only needs obedience. And that's why Bonhoeffer believed it was more dangerous than malice. Because when someone is evil, you can reason with them, you can confront them, you can call them out. But when someone is obedient, when someone believes they're just doing their job, nothing gets through. No guilt, no resistance, no second thought. They don't even feel responsible, and that leads us here. If modern evil no longer looks like evil, if it now moves quietly through emails, spreadsheets, and internal policies, then ask yourself one thing. Would you even recognize it if you were already a part of it? But this theory, this disturbing truth about institutional evil, didn't come from a think tank. It didn't come from a professor. It came from a prison cell. Dietrich Bonhoeffer wasn't an abstract philosopher. He wasn't writing from the comfort of a university. He was a pastor, a theologian, a man of faith who risked everything to stand against Hitler, while most of his country stayed silent. Bonhoeffer wasn't some outsider screaming at the system. He was inside it. He came from it. Born into one of Germany's most respected intellectual families, he believed in reason, in education, in moral progress. But then he watched the same professors who taught him logic bow to fascism. He watched the same clergy who preached compassion bless mass murder, and the same doctors who took the Hippocratic Oath design programs for sterilization and genocide. He thought reason would protect people from madness. He was wrong. He thought education would resist propaganda. It didn't. And so, from his prison cell, with a death sentence hanging over him, he wrote one of the most chilling observations of the 20th century. The great masquerade of evil has confused all ethical concepts. He didn't just mean that evil was hiding. He meant that it was wearing our values as a mask. Evil wasn't marching in the streets anymore. It was signing laws. It was holding church services. It was teaching in universities. It wasn't breaking the system. It had become the system. That's what Bonhoeffer saw. And what terrified him most was not the rise of a dictator. It was how easily millions of ordinary, moral, educated people served him. He didn't just ask, how could Hitler happen? He asked, why did so many good people serve him? Why did they carry out policies that destroyed lives while still believing they were righteous? Why did pastors preach silence? Why did judges rubber stamp injustice? Why did scientists experiment on children and then call it progress? Bonhoeffer's answer was brutal and honest, and still too uncomfortable for most people to hear. Because it wasn't about monsters, it wasn't about madmen, it was about conformity, compliance, career, cowardice. It was about how entire systems can turn morality upside down, until the worst actions look like duty, and the most decent people become tools in the hands of evil. And once that happens, once evil becomes normal, once silence becomes virtue, once obedience replaces conscience, then it's not just individuals who are guilty, it's the whole structure, and yet every part of that structure feels innocent. That's the horror Bonhoeffer faced. Not that evil had invaded Germany, but that good people had made room for it, out of fear, convenience, and a desire to belong. And that question he asked in 1943, it still hangs in the air today. Where are the righteous? Who will stand fast? Because evil never disappears. It just updates its language and waits for enough people to follow instructions. So what exactly is this thing Bonhoeffer saw? This quiet, polished, well-dressed evil that turns good people into its delivery system? It's not just individual wickedness. It's not about one bad leader or one corrupt man. Bonhoeffer was pointing at something much bigger, something harder to see, and even harder to resist. Institutional evil. Not evil committed by people breaking the system, but evil committed through the system, by people doing exactly what the system told them to do. You see, when a person acts with malice, there's usually guilt, hesitation, some sense deep down that what they're doing is wrong. But when evil becomes institutional, it no longer requires malice. It just needs a job description and enough people willing to follow it. Bonhoeffer understood this better than most. He once wrote, "Institutional evil spreads when no one feels responsible." And that's exactly what makes it so dangerous. Because when you divide responsibility across hundreds, or thousands, or millions of people, suddenly no one feels guilty. No one feels complicit, and no one feels the need to stop it. That's not a theory, it's been proven by science. In 1968, psychologists John Darley and Bib Latane ran a now famous study. They staged emergencies, students collapsing in rooms, smoke filling halls, and measured how people reacted. Here's what they found. When someone witnessed a crisis alone, they almost always helped. But when they were in a group, most of them did nothing. Why? Because they assumed someone else would act, someone else would step in, and so no one did. It's called the bystander effect, and it's not just about emergencies, it's about how modern evil survives. Because in large systems, we all assume someone else is watching, someone else is responsible, someone else will say something, but in the end, no one does. That's how institutional evil hides in plain sight, not behind closed doors, but behind shared roles, fragmented responsibility, and plausible deniability. Let me show you what that looks like today. A group of engineers discover a serious flaw in a financial algorithm, one that's silently funneling millions of dollars away from vulnerable users. But they don't report it, not because they agree with it, not because they're evil, but because it's not their department, not their job, and their boss hasn't said anything. So they stay quiet, and the system keeps running. Or take a corporate legal team that's told to delay litigation in a pollution case. They're not told to lie, they're not told to hide anything, just to stall, to strategize, to follow protocol. The poisoned community keeps drinking the water, but no one feels guilty because no one did it. That's institutional evil. It doesn't need dictators, it doesn't need mobs. It just needs well-meaning professionals who are too afraid, too tired, or too busy to speak. And once it's running, it doesn't stop when people disagree. It stops when someone takes responsibility. And in today's world, that might be the most dangerous job of all. So if institutional evil doesn't need cruelty, if it only needs people to do their jobs, then here's the next question. Why do good people go along with it? Why do they serve quietly, even when they feel something is wrong? Bonhoeffer saw the answer early, and it had nothing to do with malice. In fact, that's what makes it so terrifying. He wrote, "The most dangerous thing is not wickedness, but the surrender of thought. Not hate, not rage, but the simple act of no longer thinking for yourself." And science confirms this. In 1971, psychologist Philip Zimbardo ran the Stanford Prison Experiment, one of the most disturbing studies in human behavior. 24 healthy, educated college students, half assigned to be guards, half assigned to be prisoners. A mock prison, a 2-week simulation. But after just a few days, something went wrong. The students playing guards became abusive, cruel, dehumanizing. Why? Because they weren't acting as people anymore. They were acting as roles. And those roles, those uniforms, gave them permission to forget who they were. They weren't evil, they were obedient to the situation. And once that switch flips, once you stop thinking of yourself as a human being and start thinking of yourself as a position, everything changes. You're no longer asking, is this right? You're asking, is this what my role requires? And the brain is surprisingly good at making that switch. Psychologist Leon Festinger called it cognitive dissonance, that uncomfortable tension when your actions don't match your values. So how do people resolve it? They don't stop the action, they change the value. They start telling themselves stories. I'm not doing anything wrong. This isn't really my decision. I'm helping the system work. I'm just doing what I was trained to do. And that's how the transformation happens. From human to role, from moral agent to function, from someone who thinks to someone who signs the paper. You don't decide who lives or dies. You just approve the request. You don't decide what's ethical. You just interpret the policy. You don't decide truth. You just relay the talking points. And that is what Bonhoeffer feared most. Because once obedience becomes a virtue and questioning becomes a threat, then evil no longer needs soldiers. It only needs systems and people willing to be small pieces in a big machine. He wrote, "The silence of the righteous is more dangerous than the evil of the wicked." Not because evil wins by force, but because good people forget how to resist. And they forget because they've been taught not to think, but to comply. So now we're left with a deeper question. What part are you playing? What role have you accepted that no longer reflects who you are? Because in a world of quiet obedience, the most radical act might simply be to think again. What makes institutional evil so persistent, so effective, isn't that it hides in the shadows. It's that it wears the badge of responsibility. It operates in broad daylight. And it's repeated itself, again and again, by people who thought they were doing good. Let's start with one of the clearest examples in history, Nazi Germany. The Holocaust wasn't carried out by a handful of maniacs. It was engineered by doctors, planned by bureaucrats, calculated by engineers. and signed into law by officials who believed they were serving the nation. Train schedules had to be optimized. Chemical supplies had to be tracked. Paperwork had to be filed. And they did it, not with hatred, but with professionalism. It was genocide as a team project. And Eichmann, the man who organized the transport of millions to their deaths, stood on trial and said, "I was just following orders. I did my job." That's institutional evil, but it didn't begin or end there. In 1692, during the Salem witch trials, ordinary townspeople accused their neighbors, their friends, of witchcraft, not because they were cruel, but because they were told it was the righteous thing to do. That burning a soul today would save it tomorrow. That's the terrifying part. They believed they were doing the right thing. In the 1950s, during the Red Scare, Americans turned on each other, blacklisting co-workers, firing teachers, reporting friends, not because they had evidence, but because fear made silence feel dangerous and compliance feel safe. Once again, people weren't motivated by malice. They were motivated by duty, by belonging, by not wanting to be next. But institutional evil isn't locked in the past. Today, it's more efficient and more sophisticated. Take Facebook. Internal research showed that certain content was increasing division, radicalization, and even fueling real-world violence. They knew, and yet nothing changed, because outrage drives clicks. Clicks drive revenue, and the system was working as designed. No one pulled the trigger, no one ordered the chaos, but everyone stayed quiet and got paid. Then there's Amazon, a company praised for its innovation, while drivers pee in bottles, skip meals, and suffer injuries to meet impossible quotas. The company issues a press release: "We value our workers." Meanwhile, the algorithm tightens, the delivery times shorten, and the pressure increases. It's not one person's cruelty, it's everyone's job. That's the pattern Bonhoeffer warned us about. A pattern where morality becomes secondary to metrics, to protocol, to hierarchy. And the deeper you go into the system, the harder it is to see the harm, because it's been divided, justified, and normalized. So now, here's the question that matters most. What happens when we build systems that reward obedience and punish independent thought? What happens when the people who follow the rules rise and the ones who ask questions vanish? Because in that kind of system, you don't need monsters, you only need managers. And eventually, you'll wake up in a world where doing what's right gets you fired, and doing what's wrong gets you promoted. So ask yourself, if you found yourself in that system, would you stay silent or would you dare to think? By now, you might be thinking, if the problem is that deep, if evil can hide inside ordinary jobs, inside ordinary systems, what can we even do? Can you actually resist something that invisible and that powerful? Bonhoeffer believed you could, but not without a cost. He called it costly grace, not cheap comfort, not easy virtue, but a hard-earned clarity that comes with pain, with loss, and with choosing to think, even when it would be easier to look away. Because once you see how the system works, you no longer have the luxury of pretending. You have to choose. And that choice, it doesn't have to be loud, it doesn't have to be violent, but it does have to be conscious. It begins at the smallest level, your own mind. Are you willing to think, even if it isolates you? Are you willing to ask, who benefits from what I'm doing? What part of the machine am I helping run? Because if you can ask that, if you can stop yourself even once and question the assignment you've been handed, you've already broken the spell. But awareness alone isn't enough. We also have to act, not with outrage, but with integrity, not with noise, but with refusal. Sometimes resistance looks like one quiet word. No, I won't approve that. No, I won't repeat that lie. No, I won't hide behind the excuse of just doing my job. Sometimes it looks like the courage to say, "I don't know," because not knowing is better than blindly following. Bonhoeffer warned that silence itself becomes complicity, especially when silence is rewarded. And in many systems, it is. That's why the resistance can't just be personal. It has to become structural. We need systems that reward transparency, not obedience. We need institutions where asking hard questions is seen as loyalty to truth, not disloyalty to power. We need leaders who protect dissent, not punish it. Because if we only create systems that value compliance, then the only people who rise to the top are the ones most willing to forget who they are. Bonhoeffer's warning was clear. He said, "Freedom is not the right to do as we please, but the power to do what is right. And that power isn't given, it's chosen. In moments when it would be easier to stay quiet, you speak. In rooms where everyone agrees, you question. In systems that reward comfort, you choose truth. Because the real battle isn't between good people and bad people. It's between those who think and those who don't. So no, you may not be able to dismantle the system overnight, but you can do the one thing it fears most: refuse to be its silent tool." Bonhoeffer didn't die because he committed a crime. He didn't die because he broke the law. He died because he refused to serve evil. When his church chose safety, he chose resistance. When his peers stayed quiet, he spoke. And when the system demanded his silence, he gave it his life instead. He was hanged in 1945, just weeks before the Nazis collapsed. But before he died, he left behind one question. A question that still hangs in the air today. A question meant for you, not history. He wrote, "Who stands fast? Who remains grounded when everything around them is collapsing? Who refuses to obey, not out of rebellion, but out of responsibility? Who sees through the mask and says what no one else will? Because here's the truth. Most people don't fall to evil because they want to. They fall because it's easier. Because silence feels safer than risk. Because following feels easier than thinking. Because looking the other way keeps the paycheck coming. But evil doesn't begin with violence. It begins with small compromises, tiny silences, a quiet decision to stop asking questions. It begins when we choose convenience over conscience. And once that choice becomes habit, you don't even notice you've made it. Because now you're still showing up to work. You're still checking all the boxes. You're still saying, "That's not my responsibility." But your mind, your moral clarity, it's no longer yours. That's what Bonhoeffer feared most. Not chaos, not violence, but the slow, silent surrender of the human spirit to a system that trains people to stop thinking. And here's what you need to hear. You don't need to be a hero. You don't need to save the world. You don't need to lead a revolution. But you do need to stay awake. Because the moment you stop thinking, the moment you say, "This isn't my fight," the moment you trade truth for comfort, that's the moment the system wins. And it wins without firing a single shot. So the final question isn't theoretical. It isn't philosophical. It's painfully personal. Who will you be? When the system needs your silence, will you speak, even when your voice shakes? Will you pause, even when everyone's rushing forward? Will you think, even when thinking is punished? Because you don't need to change the world. You just need to make sure you're not helping it stay broken. That's it. No slogans, no heroism. Just one quiet daily decision to think, to feel, to refuse what you know is wrong. And maybe, just maybe, that's where real freedom begins.